Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Whalen. I'm the Associate Director for Communications in the Division of Marketing and Communications. Thank you for bearing with us. We had a few technical delays getting started. I'm happy to be here to help moderate this event, but first I'm going to ask our President, Dr. Vianne Timmons, to say a few words.
So good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit of this beautiful province. We want to encourage all of you to reflect on the lands where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I want to welcome Dr. Michael Strong, the president of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and it's fun for me to hear him. I was a PI on a knowledge translation grant with CIHR a number of years ago when I was actively researching as a professor. And so I have great excitement when I hear anyone who gets a CIHR grant. Also, my daughter Nancy Mason McClellan works for CIHR, and she told me that Dr. Strong's a great guy. So that's the best acknowledgement that you can get, is when your daughter says the person that you're hosting is a fabulous person. Also joining us is Adrian Mota, the Associate Vice President, Research Programs and Operations at CIHR. So welcome virtually to our beautiful university, Memorial University. We are incredibly grateful to CIHR for its ongoing support of our leading edge research that is helping improve the health outcomes for all Canadians. So today's session is to provide you, Memorial community, the opportunity to learn more about CIHR and its priorities. And it also gives, Dr. Strong an opportunity to hear directly from you, to learn how the pandemic has affected researchers and your activities, and to get a better understanding of what we do here at Memorial. So I'm going to hand it over to Neil Bowes, our Vice President Research, for a few brief words. Neil?
Thank you, Vianne. We are delighted to host CIHR for this interactive session. As Newfoundland and Labrador's university, Memorial plays a pivotal role in driving innovation and fostering new research ideas. Through groundbreaking research, scholarship, and creative activity of all of our talented faculty, staff, and students, Memorial is contributing to the social, cultural, and economic development of Newfoundland and Labrador and well beyond. CIHR and the Government of Canada's long-term support is allowing Memorial to build special research capacity. You're going to hear more from CIHR and members of our community in a few moments. I'm also pleased Dr. Robert Bertolo, a professor in our Department of Biochemistry in the Faculty of Science, who is Memorial CIHR University Delegate, is also joining us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Strong. He was appointed President of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research on October the 1st, 2018. Prior to joining CIHR, he was the Dean of the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry and a distinguished university professor at Western University. Dr. Strong's clinical research has focused on understanding the cellular biology of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. He has published more than 200 peer-reviewed articles on the topic. Dr. Strong earned his degree in medicine at Queen's University and completed his postgraduate studies at the Laboratory of Central Nervous System Studies at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm now happy to turn the proceedings over to our special guest, Dr. Strong.
I am going to.
Yeah, you were muted, Dr. Strong.
Okay, can you hear me now? Oh, terrific. I want to thank you very much for your kind comments and for the welcome. I'll go to sharing my screen, and hopefully this is working for you. You can now see my presentation. Terrific. All right, what I thought I would do is spend about 15 minutes or so just giving a bit of a background, particularly in the context of the pandemic, of where we're at right now, and then really turn it over to the floor for questions, and happy to answer whatever we can for this. So the objectives of what I'd like to do today are just to cover a couple of brief points. One is to really look at what the impact of the pandemic has been on CIHR's funding strategies, but also to speak about our new strategic plan and give you a bit of a high-level overview of that. Now, in the course of the pandemic, a lot of interesting things have come forward, and one certainly which I was not that well aware of when I first came to Ottawa was the integration across the federal government of a number of facets of research. And this is actually going to be really important for us as we go forward, because on the one hand, we're nowhere near done the impact of COVID-19 on our health system and the health system research that's going to need to be done. And I'll return to that in a moment. But also that this has really been a whole of government response. And so when we think about, how research is done and funded in this country, most of us have tended to think about this first circle. And this slide is provided to me from Mona Niemer, who is a pretty good overview of how things are running across all the different systems. So that's providing is pretty much, the tri-councils, what we expect from the university sector, from philanthropic and from charitable organizations. What is often not seen is the depth of research that's also done within the government itself, whether this be through NRC or the Public Health Agency and so on. And often we will refer to this as being our extramural programs, and these are the intramural programs. And certainly, as I'll allude to in a moment, a lot more integration has had to occur over the course of the pandemic between these two aspects of research, and you'll see that play out over time. The government also has a very strong role to play in facilitating partnerships and economic development, so that really through ISED. And then the sort of global community in which we operate, and certainly as the G7 discussions are ongoing this summer about a framework to talk about data transfer, preparation for pandemics and such, you can see how across the federal network, there's an awful lot that's going on, and that we are but one part of it. And that, as I say, will be important to us as we move forward in the future. Now, everybody's interested in what did the budget really mean. So I thought I would spend a few moments on bringing you up to date on as we understand the current budget. Now, that might sound a little bit odd for me to be saying it that way, but when the budget is presented, it is a very high-level overview of a very complex document. And as we proceed to operationalize it, we receive what are called the records of decision. So these are really the details. They explain to us what it is was the intent of what we were to achieve. And as that then moves forward into actually submitting it into the funding avenues that would be necessary, there's a lot of clarity that is gained with that. So as we understand it currently, the Clinical Trials Fund, which is a major initiative, $250 million over 3 years, includes operating costs. And this is really to be thought of in the context of the biotherapeutics, biomanufacturing initiatives that the government is taking on to really bring us to a level of self-sufficiency in this country. Right now, it's obviously highlighted by the vaccine developments that are required, but there are so many others that are going to be needed as we move forward in the future so that we are really self-sufficient. But it does mean that it creates a pipeline, and this pipeline is from the nascent discovery all the way through to commercialization, impact on policy development, scaling up industry relationships, and such for that. And so the CIHR role in this is really at the front end of that pipeline to ensure that, if we're looking down the pipeline, it's not a clear line of sight to the other end, but rather filled with research, with skills, with the HQP, the high quality personnel that need to be trained to support this. So you'll see this is the beginnings of that process for us. Both pediatric cancer and the Women's Health Initiative are very specific mandate-driven ones. On the pediatric cancer side, it really is to build a framework to ensure that pediatric cancer research in this country is sustained over a prolonged period of time. Already lots that's done through our Institute of Cancer Research. However, this goes over and above that, and we'll be partnered with many of the initiatives there. On women's health, this is often termed as being a Women's Health Institute, but I do want to be very clear. It is not the 14th Institute for CIHR. That's a phraseology issue. It is, in fact, going to be within our Institute for Gender and Health, and we'll look at specific issues of under-researched and high priority areas of research in women's health. It's 20 million over 5 years. Certainly, as reflected in the pandemic, the need to develop mental health standards, which are national in nature, largely driven by the Public Health Agency of Canada, but we will be participating in that to assist in the evaluative processes for it. Diabetes research, particularly towards both type 1 and type 2, knowing that the diabetic pandemic is really upon us. So a large amount of funding there. What you're seeing here is within the public health side of it, and we will be looking at half of those funds for research programs. The Biomedical Research Fund is one of those ones which also links to the biomanufacturing, biotherapeutics initiatives of the government. So this really is about the tri-agencies coming together to help develop the research programs, which would be interdisciplinary, which would help not only feed that pipeline, but again, creating the skill sets, the HQP that are behind all of that, but also ultimately in bringing nascent ideas forward. So you'll hear lots more about that over the course of this summer as that gets more clearly formulated. You'll also have seen that there was a specific allotment of funding to CFI. And Dr. Runte did a lot of work on this initially by working with the community, particularly around the areas of level 2+3 laboratories, the types of containment facilities that we need for particularly virus research, but there are other areas as well. So a significant proportion of this funding will find its way directly towards scaling up or expanding existing facilities. It's not so clear that it will be for brand new facilities, but a significant proportion of the remaining part of the funding, we're beginning to look at how does that link to the tri-agency fund as well, because again, this is meant to support the development of the biomanufacturing, biotherapeutics types initiatives moving forward. So you'll hear a lot more information on that as the months unfold. NSERC on the College and Community Innovation Program. I placed that in here because although that's not a direct CIHR access, so to speak, many of our investigators work closely with colleges within their communities for many of the research projects that are being brought forward that require a lot of that technological or access into industry-based components to it. So something to be watching very closely if you're an investigator. Same thing on the SSHRC side of the equation, 12 million over 3 years to really look at this issue of systemic barriers and how they affect diverse groups. That could have really gone to any one of the 3 agencies to look at. SSHRC is best prepared and aligned for looking at that and taking us forward. So we'll be working very closely with them, and you'll see research granting coming out through SSHRC driven around this. So I watch that very closely on the research front. I wanted to spend a moment on this slide, which really talks about the CIHR budget and how it has been affected by this. So here on the light blue on the base is about 1.1 million, which is the 2017-18 dollars that were brought in and are virtually all attributed towards our 3 major research programs, right? Those which run through the institutes, things that are called ring-fenced, and then the open grant competition. What you see here in the orange is the investment that was made in 2018 and increasing. This is the last year of an increase, of a pre-planned increase in the CIHR budget. And so we have a lot of work as we're starting to move forward in the next budget cycles to discuss about further increases and what it will look like. But in the course of this pandemic year, you'll see a significant elevation of funding, and you'll see some of it carried forward. These 2 colors, they're best thought of as these are statutory or voted authorities, the dark blue. Think of them as one-time, ongoing. So the light blue is really one-time funding. So that's upwards of 20 different competitions that we brought forward to be part of the whole of government response to the pandemic. a really incredible response from Canadian investigators on that. Funding as well that provided assistance for support at universities and students. This blue was actually the two of these combined together initially, but we managed to move some of the funds forward into this year for these medical countermeasures, so continued research in the area. And that's why you see continued programs in the course of this year. But you'll also know funding or see funding that is going to continue to flow forward here. And this is one of the very, very few funding initiatives that have multi-year funding, and that's the Center for Pandemic Preparedness or Research into Pandemic Preparedness and Health Emergencies. Lots more to be heard about that over the summer, and I can answer questions on that if you'd like. So the important piece on this graph is really twofold. One is that as we had additional funding coming in to support the pandemic, it was not at the expense of our open competitions or any of our other competitions. So the funding, although we had to juggle timelines and such for it, continued to flow for this. And people were often worried about, was there a loss of funding in the overall portfolio? And the answer was no. There was a very specific addition that was put into it. The second is that we're not out of the woods by any means on the COVID-19 side of the equation. Again, I'll return to that in a few moments. In terms of our pressure on applications, we follow this obviously very closely. On average, we're about 2,300 applicants into each of our open competitions, so twice a year, our spring and our fall one, and that's been very stable. You'll notice a lower level here in the spring of 2020. Those applications came in before the pandemic and were to have been adjudicated and did get adjudicated in the summer at that. So even with the addition of some of the early arrivals of foundation grant holders in, we're still sitting at about that 2,300 applicant mark for the funds that are available there. So what do I see coming ahead of us? Well, there's a couple of things that I think you really want to keep an eye on. One is really this concept of One Health, and this is increasingly gaining steam internationally. Many of us have worked in this area, have understood it for a long period of time. But you're going to hear about it coming out of the G7 this summer. We're already seeing documents, for instance, the UN Research Roadmap for Recovery, clearly referring to the concept of One Health. The European Union is speaking of it well. And really, this is talking about what got us into this in the first place. This intersection between the environment, animals within the environment, and our own health, and the transmissibility of either disease or antibiotic resistance, or we could go on for quite a number of things there. So this concept of how do we address all of these as a single predictor or determinant of health outcomes is a very important one, and you will be seeing more development along those lines, both internationally and as well from a Canadian vantage. The second area to keep an eye on is really one that's being somewhat trialed right now. One of the things that became evident when the emerging variants of the virus came forward just before Christmas, although early hints of that in September, was that we really lack the capacity to rapidly bring about an integration of our research programs with what we're understanding about the evolution of the virus. So that if a new variant of concern emerges, is it of relevance to us from a disease output, from an immunological response, from the need for the vaccine, and so on, and even helping inform our public health approaches. And so this idea of an integrated variants strategy, which really bridges Health Canada, PHAC, and the National Medical Laboratories, CanCoGen, which is the genomics aspect of this, CIHR, and a number of provincial territorial partners, really a critical new model to see how we can integrate in this country, bringing data together really quickly, informing the science, and then continuing that virtuous cycle to look at better health outcomes. I think you'll be seeing this play out more in the future, as this is early days in it, but it certainly is a successful approach. And so I do expect to see more of that. Finally, the post-COVID condition. There isn't a body system that's unaffected by the post-COVID condition. We don't know the magnitudes yet. We certainly don't know the cell biology, although there's early hints in some systems for it. And this will be generational. There are everything from the psychosocial manifestations through to a host of organic or organ-specific impacts later on. There's going to have to be a lot of work to be done on this. Everything from surveillance to understanding basic cellular functions through to the therapeutics approaches. So keep an eye on that. It will really start to develop, I think, over the next year and thereafter. Now, how does this all relate to our strategic plan then? And there's always timing, and this probably in hindsight couldn't have been a better timing for us to come forward with a strategic plan, which everybody worked at incredibly hard over the course of the first 2 years, certainly that I've been here. It was the single largest effort that we've done in bringing in the community in the history of the CIHR to create a strategic plan. But the concepts behind it are really, even though it's just been released, continue to be extremely contemporary. And it really is looking at this integration between the biological, behavioral, psychosocial, social determinants of health to really look at how do we tackle health inequalities in this country. And really frames the CIHR slightly differently, although very, very true to our initial act and vision. It has 5 main priorities and a 6th one which speaks to the organizational excellence, or our delivery mechanism. So the first 5 really speak to the research aspects. And the way to read these, and I'm not going to go through every one in great detail, is that each one clearly delineates. So here we're looking at advancing excellence in all of its diversity. And it gives you on each one, what would we expect to see within 10 years? And so here, for instance, we're talking about health research in Canada being internationally recognized as inclusive, collaborative, transparent, culturally safe, focused on real world impact. And each one of those comes with a set of specific strategies. What is needed to achieve that? Now, when we went back out last fall to make sure that this still resonated in the midst of the pandemic, we also heard that to be certain that we released what the action plan would be simultaneously with this, and we did. So I'll come back to that as a final slide to show you how to look at that as well. But each one of these is accompanied by a series of actions that gives you a timeline in which they will anticipate being achieved and what we will be expected to deliver to you during that. The second one talks about strengthening our health research capacity. And again, the 10-year vision to be global leaders in the development of groundbreaking discoveries. It really talks about strengthening our investigator-initiated research, a very broad mandate, but one we're going to be having to return to the community to say, okay, what does this truly mean for you? Because it talks about our funding formulas, and it talks about how we ensure that teams or individuals continue to succeed. Career support, equity, diversity, and inclusion, our rapid response capacity, all embedded in this. We live in a country that has a very rich history with regards to Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of healing. And the strategic plan speaks specifically to that and recognizes the need for us to really bring together and integrate different ways of research, different ways of understanding health outcomes, turning to our Indigenous partners and really using a distinctions-based approach to ensure that research is supported and driven by Indigenous partners. Priority D is really the money one. This talks about pursuing equitable health outcomes through excellence in research, right? And this really is a longer term vision. Nobody's going to say that in 10 years, we're going to get equitable outcomes for Canadians, across the country, but we certainly have to be making inroads at understanding how to get there and starting to have impact. And so CIHR has really very clearly stated that your health outcomes in this country should be independent of where you live. How do we strive for that? And what is the research that's required? And it includes that we're part of a global community where there is rich learnings, but also a very rich history of our participation. And this last one, which is a really important one, takes us back to our roots. CIHR, when it was formed, had an incredibly deep history and this country a deep expertise in knowledge translation, synthesis, mobilization, what we're calling knowledge mobilization in the fullness of it at this time for it. And we've maintained that strength, but we're no longer clearly following a path that says, here's where we need to be. Here's how we need to continue to be leading the world in this area. And this is a call to return to that. And so as we look at the action plan that would go with this one, just even taking one of the specific strategies, which would be the advancing of science, of knowledge mobilization, it has to start with working with the community to understand exactly what that means and to develop a clear strategy moving forward on it. We haven't had one since 2009. And so if we're going to return to this, we have to be very clear. as to what it is that we're trying to achieve. How do we place resources into it? There's a call for us specifically to ensure that we've got the infrastructure to support it. So how might this look when we start to put it all together? And I use here strategic patient-oriented research, which really is a major initiative that's now well into producing the results that it was anticipated to. But if one were to look at SPORE, it touches all 5 of these major strategies. And this is what we want to see as we're moving forward. As we're making decisions around where should we be investing, what should our new programs look like, we'll be turning to the strategic plan to say, does it align? Now, nothing has to align 100%. You don't have to be checking on all 5, but we really want to see that we're doing as well as we can. If we can get to all 5, terrific. How does this work? And it's a very integrated plan that allows us to do that. So that's a really high-level view of not only where we've been in the course of this past year. I know there's been a lot of questions with regards to programs and how funding will look like and what the budget meant. And how does the strategic plan play into all of this? So what I'm hoping is I've given you a bit of a view of that, and I'll turn this back and be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much.
Do I return the screen to you, or?
I believe you'll be able to turn off the screen yourself using the share button. And if not, maybe Darcy can help us with that. And while we're trying to figure out that technical side of things, I'll just describe how we can ask and answer questions today. So our panelists will be able to use the Q&A function that you see in the bottom right corner of your screen to type your questions, and I can relay that to the panelists on your behalf. The second way you can participate is to let me know also through that Q&A function that you'd like to come on screen and speak directly with Dr. Strong and our panelists, and we'd be happy to make that happen for you. You'll have to turn on your camera and mic, of course, so that we can see and hear you. So I'll ask our panelists to try to keep their questions or their answers as brief as possible while still answering the question so that we can hear from as many people as we can in the next half hour. I'll let you know that we are taping this session and we will be sharing it after the event for those who weren't able to join us today. And the last note I'll make before I get into questions is that I always see a whole pile of questions pile in the very last few minutes that we just can't get to. So if you do have a question or comment, I hope that you'll get it into the system earlier so that to increase the likelihood that we'll be able to hear from you. So, but to kick us off, I'd like to ask Darcy to help us get Dr. Robert Bertolo on screen. As Dr. Bose mentioned, Dr. Bertolo is the university delegate for CIHR and a professor in the Department of Biochemistry. And it'll just take a minute. There you are, Dr. Bertolo. Would you like to start us off with the first question?
Yeah, certainly. Well, thanks, Dr. Strong. That was interesting update, especially regarding the strat plan and the forward thinking of CIHR. And I guess from Memorial's perspective, we're really interested in the position of the non-U15 universities, or those medium-sized universities that aren't so emphasized on research. Like top of mind at Memorial in particular is that the success rate and especially the application rate to CIHR programs has really been devastated. Especially, I mean, the reforms themselves. I mean, obviously we don't have to talk about the failure of the reforms, but that really did hurt a lot of enthusiasm for applying to CIHR, especially at Memorial. And I think even since the reforms, our application rates went from we had probably about 30 applications per cycle. Just after the reforms, and that's gone down to 15 last year, and we only had 7 in the fall. And so it's not even the success rate, which is below average, but it's also just the application rate. And I just have a feeling, there's a lot of discouragement, especially amongst early career researchers or the non-U15 researchers. And, just as an example, I was wondering if CIHR has any sort of plan around this. And as an example, we used to have the Regional Partnerships Program, which I know had its issues. But one thing that program really did well for us was it really brought the provincial government to the table. Because it was a matching program, the provincial government almost had no choice but to not leave federal money on the table. And I know that dissolved with the reforms, but I was just wondering if, CIHR has any plan to implement some kind of matching program or some kind of program that we can use to, approach our provincial government and leverage some of that funding, or any other ideas that you have about, encouraging non-U15 universities to get back in the game, if you will.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's a couple of facets to answering that, and I know I've been asked that we be quick, but I think this is a really important one. So on the first part of all of this, one of the, in our strategic plan, one of the key parts is to really look at how do we ensure that we are providing sufficient funding, or what does the research program look like across this country. And so while many of the items that we have within the plan are very much, this is what we're going to do today to move things forward, that is one where it's actually, and we're coming back out to the community to look for your best ideas as to how we can start to improve this. You know, if we assume that, you know, we'll continue to see some funding come through that will support the COVID kinds of initiatives going forward, it's not so clear to me at the moment that we're going to be seeing just a carte blanche increase in the overarching funding, so that which would go into the open competitions. That means that we've got to start being a bit more creative, right, to try and increase those success rates. And there were some programs in the past that were very successful in that. And I have no fear about going back and having a look at, you know, pre-reform programs and saying, if they worked, why did we get rid of them? If we got rid of them, then could we improve them? So part of this exercise, and it's not going to take forever, it's going to be over the course of this next year, is to really reach out to all the communities and say, all right, are there ways in which we can improve this? There are some really interesting ones that are already coming up on the table, and I've spoken about these as I was doing some of the pre-pandemic sort of meetings with universities. You know, things like, for instance, high-risk, high-yield grants. You know, ones that don't require a lot of data in place, like akin to R21s south of the border. You know, what would they look like if we were to try to bring in those? Those are as important for early careers as they are for mid-career people in particular, because it would give you funding for a couple of years to really move forward with a bit of a shift in your research program that you might not take to the CIHR for fear of just getting hammered at peer review. So innovations along those lines. The other things that we're doing is we're looking carefully at what are the best practices of those universities that do really well within CIHR. And it's not just U15. There are some non-U15 universities that are doing very well too. And there are some common features, right? And you know, one of the most common is really intensive internal peer review before a grant even gets to see the light coming forward. And those numbers are pretty clear. The other ones, and this is a program that Adrian and the team introduced a number of years ago, are really the sort of peer review in training, the opportunity for, you know, young investigators to be part and parcel of this. We know when we look at the data that the experience of that is translating into higher rates of success, not because they're known, but because they know what a good grant looks like and they've had a chance to see. So there's a lot of innovations in there that need to be looked at, but the primary one is really, you know, coming back out to the community and saying, look, things that worked, let's talk about them, let's get your suggestions, let's bring them to the table.
Thank you. And a quick note before I get into the questions, when you are submitting them, please leave them addressed to everybody rather than sending them to one person so that we can keep them orderly and make sure I can see them all. So first question that came in was from Ann Dord, and she says, can you speak to updates to a revised model of interdisciplinary training to prepare our graduates, undergraduates, graduates, and postdoctoral fellows for the new model of One Health priorities and research careers?
Terrific question. Okay, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front. So we've already begun within the CIHR realm, and then I'll make a comment or two outside of CIHR alone on that one. So, you know, one of the initiatives when I came on board was to really begin to critically look at our training programs, things that had been lost over the course of the previous years, whether it be clinician scientist training, whether it be some of our fellowship training programs, and so on. And to look at a common set of criteria for what we think should be delivered in an interdisciplinarity type of view, which means more than just, you know, a couple of disciplines within the same faculty, but, you know, interdisciplinary within a university, but also geographically interdisciplinarity. And we're piloting a few of those programs right now to get a sense for how receptive the community is to that, so that we can start to develop them a little further along with that. The Health Research Fellowship Program is a very successful one, which looks and really mandates that there would be some of that interdisciplinarity in play. We still have a lot of work to do on that because there are a lot of programs that will need to come to table for a little further along into the career. So if you're into a fellowship or a postdoctoral training and it's funded by CIHR, we're going to start to set some terms of reference as to what we really expect when we're talking about not just interdisciplinarity, but the kinds of skill sets we'd like individuals to attain that will make them marketable in the new economy. There's no doubt that we still have pockets of training in this country at the graduate or the postdoctoral level, which are a bit apprenticeship-like. And yet, we know that less than 8% of our graduates will end up in an academic position. So are we providing them the right tools to be out in the community, in industry, in business for that? And so we're going to be looking at that as well as we start to move these programs forward and do additional training there. Watch closely. So this is where I start to move out of CIHR alone. So watch closely the Tri-Agency Fund as we start to mature that in the course of this summer. Because in that one, it's very clear that this is about training HQP, so high quality personnel, that will have not just the fundamental core knowledges, whether it be over in engineering or social sciences or in the biomedical sciences, but also the skill sets as well that would allow them to go into the industry world and support the biomanufacturing initiatives at multiple different levels in there. So you'll see that there will be further development of terms of reference there, and that's happening in real time to address your question. So bit of a longer answer, but I hope that covered it for you.
I'm going to go now to a question that came in from Janelle Skeard. She said, how will the One Health perspective impact which agency to which investigators should apply? Historically, research deviating into the areas covered by NSERC or SSHRC have been diverted to one of those agencies. How can applicants ensure that their research project is balanced with respect to the One Health perspective, but ultimately under the purview of CIHR?
Yeah, it's again a terrific question. I might be a little bit over my skis on that one, a little too far forward yet, because we still have a lot of work to be done on that. Although many of us have been, looking at the concept of the intersection between global health and public health and One Health over time for it, I would say that it's really only over the course of the pandemic and maybe a slight bit before that, where the international community has started to come to the table and say, look, this has to be the mode in which we move forward in our research programs and considering about these impacts. And to be fair, I would say it's really only been the course of this spring when I've started to see it really being embedded in discussions, whether it be the UN roadmap, as I talked about, the European Economic Union, what's happening in the United Kingdom, and the G7s coming forward. And certainly within Canada, we're beginning to lead that discussion in there. So at this point, it's very early days in bringing everybody to the table to say, all right, we need to have this more holistic view, which would incorporate and be driven by the One Health aspect. Where that then lies as a research program would, obviously as the president of CIHR, my view would be it should reside within CIHR, and then we would have broad partnerships across all of, the whole of government that's participating in this, because this brings in the Food Inspection Agency, it brings in the Veterinary College, it brings in a whole host of other areas there. Those details will come forward. All I'm saying is keep an eye on it, because that is very clearly a direction of discussion. And I would anticipate in the next couple of years that we're going to start to see that as a major research thrust. But good question. Early days, though.
Anne Doward, who had asked the first question about interdisciplinary training, said, thank you for that answer. I believe a little more evidence of where the research track will go for careers, such as salary, excitement, alignment with personal values, will help keep the best and brightest contributing to Canada's knowledge economy. And I'll just hop right into the next question from Margaret Steele. She says, thanks, Dr. Strong, for coming to Memorial today. It's nice to see you. Wondered what is happening with respect to funding for MD and PhD students.
Hey, so thank you very much for that question, Margaret. You know that is deep, it cuts to my heart on that. So terrific. So look, this is actually a critical area for us to continue to move forward with. There's a whole host of reasons behind it. I could probably spend another half hour or so. The concept is really, though, around training health professionals writ large. So although certainly a lot of the writings that I've done and the work in the past is really focused on the need for the MD PhD, there's a whole range of additional scholars that are required within this whole health sector ecosystem as researchers. And so the programs that we're putting onto the books and starting to develop and then looking as to how we will fund them are really centered around that. They include the MD PhD, they include MDs who can go on and get advanced training through some of the Royal College programs. It talks about other health professionals coming in. It even talks about individuals who are outside of the health sector coming in and receiving additional training. So for instance, health geographers and such with that. It's a challenge, as it is in any climate, to find the fundings for that. So what we've been doing is that as we've been bringing forward new programs, we've built into each one of those funding for training. And it's basically one of the kinds of rules of thumbs that I brought into the CIHR is that if we're going to develop a new funding program, it has to consider the HQP a component. So you'll see that starting to come forward as we talk about our clinical trials fund. That's the work is being done on that as we speak, and there'll be some outreach there that you'll see. The Center for Research in Pandemic Preparedness and Health Emergencies, same thing for that. So we're coming back into that field. It's taking time to do it because we're having to create and build the funding lines as we bring the new programs on board. But my commitment to it remains as it was when you and I were working together.
The next question that we have is from Peter Daly, and he'd actually like to come on screen to ask, so I'll ask Darcy to help facilitate that. And Peter, in just a second, you'll see that you'll have control to turn on your camera and microphone. All right, we can see you and I think hear you, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Peter Daly with the Infectious Disease Department of Medicine. Good to see some funding going towards clinical trial development. And, in early COVID-19, we saw out of the UK that where they have clinical trials integrated into routine clinical care, they were able to very quickly develop the recovery trial evidence for dexamethasone and benefit in COVID-19, where in Canada, we kind of have a separated system where the clinical trial is not integrated within the hospital and the routine care. I guess the question for you, is there any plan to have a national clinical trial network in Canada, not based on a specialty interest, but based on infrastructure supports such that we can be faster with clinical trials?
Yes, that's a terrific question. The short answer would be yes. And we'll begin those conversations building on what we established just around Christmas time. We brought in the first of these networks. I referred to the one for the variants of concern and showed that diagram. Now that was also built a bit on the experience of saying, can we bring together a clinical trials network specifically related to the pharmacology, the treatment of the current pandemic? And so that's a little bit of our testing of the waters to see how that can be done on a national basis. And really facilitate exactly what you're describing. Now, to go one step beyond that, right? Because this is a topic of a lot of conversation, because there's two pieces to what you've alluded to. The first one is the rapidity with which you can do these trials as a cohesive entity across the country. And you're right, it should be almost a blind eye to what the issue is underlying it. Do we have the skills always ready to go to be ramped up and moved forward? So that's the first piece in all of that. And that's where we can really come to the table and help. And that's part of the expectation of what the Clinical Trials Fund will help us to do, as well as sort of the training of the skills and such for it. It's another thing to be ensured that it's embedded within the hospital system so that it becomes part of the culture of how these things are delivered with that rapidity for it. And that's really going to have to be a much more in-depth discussion across this country as to how do you really implement that. We've all been parts of the system, right, where it's not so obvious that evidence to practice moves as quickly as we would like to see that happen. But it does happen faster if you're part and parcel of the people contributing to the trial, like if you're that patient population. So understand that clearly, and it will be part of the discussion. But as we dissect the UK experience more closely to get a bit of a sense, at the moment there's that, and there's a few other little bits and pieces to it, but I'd say those are two very high on the list ones. So go back to my first part of the answer, which was yes.
Yeah, super. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for coming on screen. Just to remind folks, if you'd like to do that, you can just let me know in the Q&A function. Next question is from Chris Aubrey-Bassler. They say, Dr. Strong, thanks for your presentation. You made it sound that the Clinical Trials Fund would be primarily, if not exclusively, for pharmaceutical and device trials. Is that the case? Will purely clinical interventions, such as lifestyle counseling, be eligible?
Yeah, very good question with that. We are going to be turning out to the community to really get consultation on how broad this should be. I think the very first thing in there is that this is the beginning. of things. You know, $250 million over 3 years to support clinical trials in this country is tremendous, knowing that we've really dropped our funding on that front. But it really is the beginning of the discussion. We need to move beyond this. And so the breadth that you're describing, we're going to need to reach out to the community to get a sense for that. I will be clear, though, that part of the funding coming forward to this is within that biomanufacturing, biotherapeutic strategy and how it will contribute to that. And so there's an expectation that we will be, lockstep with bringing that forward. But that doesn't define the breadth of the program. It just really defines, one of the endpoints I have to be sure to achieve is that we're supporting that. So it's a bit of both, but I don't want to leave impression that it's one or the other. It's actually both.
Thank you. Next question I have here is from Craig Moore. He says, many provinces still exist without a provincial health research funding agency, which serves as an important source of leverage funding for things like CFI funding. Do you feel there is a role for the CIHR/federal government in reaching out to those provinces directly to emphasize how important it is in terms of providing financial support for our researchers and institutions?
There's an interesting question. I want to answer that one fairly carefully, right? Because as CIHR, we are part of the federal government, and we really are important in helping to support, a national funding program for health research in there. We, and SPORE would be a terrific example of this. Wherever possible, we develop partnerships to help expand that capacity for support. Even before the pandemic had struck, there was already a bit of a trend towards looking at, and particularly within SPORE itself, what are the roles, the respective roles that need to be played between a provincial funding body and what a national funding body might play in looking at patient-oriented research. And there was starting to be a bit of a discussion around, there are things that we can come to the table with as CIHR, very much larger, big ticket items for some of the research programs that need to be done, whereas the provinces might want to start to focus in other areas that are more directly applicable, say, to their policy development, but require the foundational research behind all of that to be done. And so the conversation had started around what does it mean at a provincial and a territorial level to have those kinds of symbiotic relationships. For obvious reasons, over the course of this past year, those discussions have been set aside to some degree because of the kind of everybody going to the wall on trying to deal with the pandemic. As we start to come out of it again, I look forward to those discussions continuing to restart, or at least to restart, so that we can be back to the table of saying, what is that relationship? It's not for us as certainly the federal funding agency to say that they must be in play, but it certainly is for us to look to develop partnership programs where it would make great sense for them to be in place to support. So I'm hoping that's a reasonable answer without sounding like I'm dancing on the head of a needle. That's the approach we're taking.
Thank you very much. Next question from Rodney Russell. How important do you think it is for every province to have at least one functional CL3 that is accessible to the university research community?
Wow. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to be honest with you, because I don't know well enough each individual province's research programs and focus for it. When I was at Queen's, or when I was at Western, for just before I left, we made a major investment in building a 2+3 facility. That was a $16 million investment to put into play. It requires the necessary faculty to do it. It requires the animal facilities support and so on. And I suspect by the fact that you're asking the question, you do understand that well in there. So in the context of what an individual province can afford at a medical center to bring that in as a research aspect, my first question would be, is it appropriate to the level of the research that you see that you need to be doing? Is it fitting within the strategic plan of the university or the health research enterprise to put it into play? And if it's justifiable at that level because of the costs for it and such around it, then that would be the answer to me, as opposed to saying that each province should have one. I would be more concerned that having one would necessarily lead to it being mothballed if there wasn't the support and the need behind it all. they're not for the faint of heart. We put a lot of money into building those, well, to building one, and certainly the cost to scale up is not insignificant either. So, you know, I go back to my beginning. I don't know the answer to that. I can just give you an insight.
Thank you. Jacqueline Carter Major asks if you could speak to the continuity of peer review at CIHR, that is, having the same reviewers, or some of the same reviewers at least, involved in reviewing revised and resubmitted proposals.
Yeah, terrific question. And we have certainly heard this one repeatedly, you know, as we've moved through developing the strategic plan. In the course of this year, and this speaks directly to priority B, that, you know, ensuring strengthening our health research system, that's built into that conversation around what can we do to ensure that consistency between individual reviews, so that you're not getting a whole new panel of people, you know, a whole new 2 or 3 people reading your grant all over again when you submit it back in, so that there is a bit of continuity there. You know, project officers, program officers, such as what's used in the States. This came up in many, many areas of regions where I was having conversations around it, where there's sort of like the inherent memory of the process itself. So you might have a project officer who's assigned to, you know, 5, 6, 7 different panels, but is aware this grant, you know, this is the 3rd or 4th time that it's appeared right now. It's had 3 or 4 different sets of reviewers. We need to get consistency. How does that work? Contact things. So in a short answer of all of it, we certainly heard that. It will be on the table in the discussions this summer as we look to what do we need to do to improve the peer review system to get those kinds of consistencies. Absolutely get it. And, you know, as a final comment on all of that, certainly been a recipient to that end where I've sent in grants and have no idea if the original people read it a second time. So I know what you're talking about.
Thank you. And Peter Daly had another question. So I'm hoping, Darcy, can you help us get Peter Daly back on screen? We have just 5 minutes left, and this is the last question that I have in the queue. So after that, we'll move into our final remarks. And Peter, I'll ask you to try and keep it brief, just so that, respecting the last few minutes we have.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You brought up antimicrobial resistance, and I think this is a crucial issue going forward. It's been described as the global warming of medicine. And we have this problem in infectious disease where the pharma is not engaged in developing new antibiotic drugs because the market is simply not profitable to them. And we need a whole new way of developing antibiotics, which is not based on market share and profit. And so I wonder if there's any initiatives within CIHR to think towards new funding models for drug development, because we are running out of these drugs.
Yes, yeah. Peter, terrific question. And we've spent a lot of time. We had put in a fairly formal proposal to really start to go down the avenue that you're describing with that. And in the budget, funding was brought forward on antimicrobial resistance, but it's really in right now that funding is the Public Health Agency, CFI, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency lineage of work that's being done in there. The very basic science that you're describing that needs to be done, which would incorporate bringing in the pharmaceutical agencies to work with us on those fronts for it. We're going to continue to push at that from a budgetary point of view and keep it on the table. The decision was simply made at this point in time to go first phase on that, and then the second phase would be the actual more fundamental research that you're describing. So I'm hoping that, you know, if I come back in a year's time after our next budget thing, I'll be able to say, yep, we got it. But yeah, it's front and center for us. Chiru Kaushik and her team have been working really hard on that. With Triple
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
You're muted, Megan.
Sorry, folks. Wondering if any panelists have any final remarks.
Well, I'll just say thank you very, very much for the invitation. I do have a number of friends and colleagues in your shop, and I look forward to when we can actually come out and visit. But I also very much appreciate not only the invitation, but terrific questions. I'm hoping that we were able to give you some answers that were helpful.
Maybe I'll make some concluding comments, Megan. So first of all, I really enjoyed this. And as a biomedical clinical scientist, you are very well positioned to lead CIHR. I also want to personally thank you for your work on ALS. I have a brother-in-law with ALS, and I know how devastating that condition is, not only to the person, but to the family around them. you know, the work you do is so critical. You have to get the grants out the door, create partnerships. You have immense expectations from the organization, from a variety of stakeholders. And I can tell that you're passionate about your work, that you're extremely hard worker, and the strategic plan is a really such an accomplishment. So on behalf of Memorial University, thank you to you. Thank you to everyone who participated. We need to keep the conversation going. I want to get more CIHR grants out of this campus. I don't want to see it decrease, Neil. I want to see it increase. So we need to really work to get more grants out and more grants approved. And thank you very much, Dr. Strong. And give Nancy my best. I haven't seen her in over a year and a half, and I can't wait to give my daughter a big hug.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, thank you very much for that, and look forward to seeing you. Take care.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Megan, for an amazing job.
Thank you. Have a